we hear that a lot. And I think that point you made there, that you can't see how it got there, that's the bit to hold on to, because it often is that we've missed it. We haven't actually noticed it. It isn't necessarily that it's going straight up there. It is true that sometimes people can sit in that yellow zone quite a lot of the time, and it's often hard for them to feel calm and regulated, but it's pretty rare for it just to shoot up. It's more the case that we're most likely to miss it, not see it in some way. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. So this probably isn't as revolutionary for you guys as it was for me, but as a clinical psychologist working in the disability area, I really came into the field some sort of 16, 17 years ago, and we still were quite behavioural at that point in time. And there was a lot of focus on the need to really understand the behaviour as much as we can, understand what we call the function of the behaviour, or what it might be telling us about what's happening in that situation. But we still were really focused on the behaviour. And I often found myself as a new grad psychologist feeling quite stuck by that, and also feeling very stuck in trying to help families to navigate this thing called behaviour as well. But I've been fortunate to work with some wonderful families, some excellent colleagues over the years, and it's really taught me the importance of expanding our focus beyond the behaviour itself. But if we think about it, if we focus on the behaviour as a problem, it means we only see the behaviour. Therefore, we only see the problem. The other difficulty with that is it's quite common for us to then fuse the behaviour and the person together as one. Does that make sense? So you don't actually necessarily see the behaviour, you see the person as the behaviour. Okay, and that's where sometimes it's quite easy for us then to be thinking about those attributions. So we've heard some of it today. They're being manipulative, they're being targeting, they've got a nasty streak, whatever it is that we might attribute to when we actually see that person and that behaviour fused together as one. But I guess the question is, and we've been starting to explore this morning, what happens if we actually change our focus from the behaviour itself to what might be underlying that behaviour? And more importantly for us as family members, what do we see? What do we think about? And how do we actually feel when we start to actually look at, well, what's happening for that person rather than just what's happening with the behaviour? I'm going to hand over to Maggie and Jody now to actually talk a little bit about their experiences in terms of how their thoughts and feelings changed when they shifted their focus from looking at the behaviour itself to actually looking more at, well, what's happening for their child.
Thanks, Frank. So I think for us it was all about, okay, here's my little boy who's actually trying to get a message across to me. He's not this terrible child who's he is still challenging, but it's about me looking at it a different way, and that makes a big difference to how you respond. So it was just knowing that he was communicating something for him was unmet, something was needed, and making an effort to stop and think, okay, this child he doesn't need a consequence because he can't control this about himself. There's something else going on for him, and there's something else that perhaps I could be doing differently that could help him, or maybe make a difference to how he's feeling, because I know when he's in that red zone, he can't help it. But if I can keep him in the green zone, then I know I'm doing something right. I'm helping him.
Yeah, for us, just realising that Ayana was basically crying out for help. She's realising that she was using her negative behaviour as a communication tool. That was the start of a big change. By understanding her needs, it helped us to establish a better environment for her so we could make her feel safe and secure and support her. This meant just starting with slowing things down, running her through the process, giving her time to respond. We didn't even put her in a situation. It was just demands and this and that, and let's get through the day. Just using some routines and schedules and engage in activities. But knowing that the behaviour will occur, but not escalating it and putting ourselves in her shoes, just calming her or redirecting her, it started to help build the relationship and the trust back between Ayana and us as parents. And then the behaviour dramatically reduced already there and then. And that was beginning to a new journey. Yeah.
Just want to add, just as a parent, this isn't to do with disability or just in parenting, is can you think about an example for yourselves where you've been in a situation where your kids are engaging in a behaviour that is confronting for some reason, and perhaps we might go through that escalation cycle ourselves, and we are thinking that behaviour needs to stop. Can you remember back to that time and think about how it felt yourself? Did you feel your stress levels rising? Did you find yourselves going through that escalation curve in terms of being reactive? Yep, certainly I do. But then have you found yourself in a situation where you can step aside from it, view the behaviour, and then look at it in terms of, oh, heck, you're really anxious. This is really difficult for you. Put aside the behaviour. Have you been in one of those moments too? Can you envisage and remember how you felt at the time? Did you feel calmer? Did you think differently about your child at the time? Did you come up with different ideas about what you might do about it? And this is what we're talking about here, is that it's not always easy to do. This is the bit. I think I gave an example once, one of these workshops just with one of my kids, just an everyday thing where, one of my kids was transitioning to high school at the time and his behaviour was terrible over just when he first started high school. And, he was really, I will use the words that parents use in terms of he was non-compliant, he was, arguing, he wouldn't do things, and verbally being quite, using swear words at me, etc., etc. And as a parent, quite confronted with that. And automatically I could go down this pathway of, well, there needs to be consequences for that behaviour and etc., etc. And those automatic thoughts come up for me. That was really what I wanted to do. But I was able to step aside and go, oh gosh, you're actually overwhelmed. Your behaviour is telling me that you are totally overwhelmed. And when I had that thought, it all just slotted into place as to all the things that had overwhelmed him. And I went, oh gosh, you really are. You've lost your friendships. You've just started a new school. You don't know how to do homework. All this stuff, he was pushing back because he was trying to keep control over a world that he felt out of control in. Totally anxious. So therefore, over here, if I was looking at what he was saying and doing to me, it would have been a consequence model. Over here, when I'm looking at overwhelm, it was, right, what do I need to do to help you in terms of getting your homework done, coping, calming down, etc., etc. I might address the swearing at me at a later time. Talk about it, that's not the way to talk to mum but not when he's distressed. My goal is about helping him cope and not be so overwhelmed. I can talk to him later on when he isn't overwhelmed about how he might communicate that another time. Not a consequence for that. Does that make sense? This is what we're talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so we think about the journey we've been on this morning. We started off by thinking about the behaviour. That's the bit we see. That's the bit that's evident in front of us. And that's the information that we're dealing with and trying to understand and make sense of. But what we've also been looking at is the importance of actually focusing then on what's happening for the person. And that example that Deb just shared about her son is a great example of that. Is what happens to our understanding and our thinking when we start to actually appreciate where is our child, our loved one at in terms of that moment in time and their level of distress. What's actually going on for them? What's going on for them in their brain? How are they feeling emotionally? So that's what we've been looking at in terms of what's happening for the person. But when we see this, when we see the behaviour and when we get a sense that a person is in high levels of distress and struggling with that, what that tells us is actually there's some gaps. There must be some gaps in terms of what's happening for that person and their needs to feel regulated, to feel calm, to feel sure of what's happening for them. They're not feeling that way. They're not feeling regulated. So we've heard that term dysregulation. They're feeling really unsettled, really unsure. But what's going on with that? Why is that? And that's where we start to look at, okay, what's going on in the environment around the person that might be influencing the way they're feeling? And that's the bit we're going to look at next. Yep. We find this is what we call the Iceberg Concept. It's actually a visual that was introduced to us by a family that Debbie supported some years ago. And it's a really neat way of kind of looking at how do we understand all the things that influence, all of us really, but if we particularly think about our loved ones and our children, what are all the different things that might actually be impacting on them and affecting how they then feel and then what they do in terms of behaviour or other forms of interaction? So what we actually see, if you think about it, with the behaviour is only the tip of the iceberg. It's a bit above the water. But as we know with icebergs in real life, most of it is actually underneath the surface. And we can't actually see that immediately. But the behaviour is a clue for us that something is not right in terms of a person's level of distress, calmness, their sense of well-being. What we know is that tells us there must be some gaps in terms of what their needs, in terms of their needs being met. If we think about it, all of us have needs and there are lots of influences on us in a number of areas of our lives. So we have, what's happening for a person, what's happening in the family as well. So we've been talking a lot this morning about the crisis cycle or the stress cycle and that curve and those colours, the traffic light colour system. And we've also been talking about how that we're not only thinking about that in terms of the person themselves or our child, our loved one, we're also thinking about it in terms of us and other family members and other people in someone's life as well. That we all have our own process. We all operate within a system. None of us actually live within a bubble. That's the important thing here. We all operate within a context. And so that all of these things are actually going on for us. So there's a person's communication and daily living skills, their ability to be able to communicate accurately and clearly what's going on for them. There's the influence of all the different relationships and the interactions that we have. There's how healthy we are and how well our family is working together in supporting one another. All of these things can certainly influence us, as well as the other environments that we operate in, so school contexts and community and things like that. So to the degree that the environment we're in matches our needs at a particular point in time, that influences how we actually feel and how we then behave. So this is the point here, that when we are actually seeing this disruption in behaviour, it tells us that there are some things going on for that person, but that also tells us then that there are some unmet needs within the context or within the environment around that person. I'm going to ask Maggie and Jody to share a little bit more, but to actually talk a bit about how when they started to look at this, what influence that had on the supports they actually then started to think about putting in place for their children, and what also they noticed in terms of how their children responded.
For Jamie, being nonverbal, obviously communication was a big part of his unmet need. And we didn't need a system that was just going to be about choice making. I wanted to have a really robust system that I could have conversations with him, use jokes, just the things that I do with my other children. So we were lucky enough to be involved with Jackie and another mum whose sons in their 20s are using a pod system. And we used this book for communication, and we don't just use it at home, we also use it at Jamie's school, so it goes everywhere with him. If we leave the house, he takes his book with him. So it's a little book that's got, I didn't bring it today, unfortunately, but it's got pictures and words in it, and it's sectioned into categories. And he's learning how to use it, and we're learning how to use it with him too. But it made a huge impact on his relationships with his brothers and sisters, because they had a way of communicating with him. It wasn't all just guesswork. Obviously, we still use his body language and facial expressions and sounds, but we use the communication book to really help with his communication with his brothers and sisters. We also, another huge unmet need was his sensory needs. So he loves to chew on things. We make sure he's got something available for him, so he's always chewing on something on the bus on the way to school, or in the classroom he's got access to it, because taking that away from him will raise his levels of anxiety. So we really tried to change the way we communicated with him, help him with his sensory needs, and we also try to support his relationships with his siblings and obviously grandparents, anyone who comes in contact with him. We also had a look at how he's interacting with us, because we found that we didn't... We were giving him a lot of attention when he had a lot of challenging behaviour, but we needed to be giving him more attention when he was calm and happy. He needed that level of stimulation. I think that's about it.
Thanks. With Ayana, there was a lot of unmet needs. It kind of goes across all of them. We realised there was gaps in all the areas. Just a couple of the most obvious unmet needs was obviously communication. She had no verbal communication. She didn't have anything. So we just started from scratch, started keyword signing, just body language, natural gestures. And then we also got a tough book, which had board maker on, to try and entice her with music and the language system. We also tried pod, and we are still using it, and we're using it all because we figure... don't take anything away, give them as many tools as you can. That's the most important part. It's really important for them. And she's actually now using 6 to 8 words, which is amazing. And we definitely wouldn't be taking any of the tools away from her. Another really big one for Ayana was sensory. She has a fold in her brain. So she's really sensory and also orally sensory. She would just eat and eat and eat, and we knew something was quite different here. She wasn't obviously hungry, we didn't think. She'd had 3 meals and snacks, etc. But one day she picked up what we call a chewy. It was just a hair tie without metal in it, and she started chewing it. And I didn't even know what sensory meant, that word didn't mean anything to me. So when she started chewing this, she was calmer, and it was like, whoa, this is great. She was self-regulating, and although it was really awesome to see, I was really ashamed to take her outside the house like that. You know, it was like she had this big black mouth guard on, and I didn't want to take her to the shop, so I was thinking about what other people would think, and I didn't think any other people were chewing out in the community apart from gum, you know. So, but when I realised that it's either going out to the shops and having the behaviours or letting her do what meets her needs. And it was like, well, this is about Ayana. It's not about what other people think or what I think. This is what she needs. This is what is important to her. This is what helps her, you know. So that was a big light bulb moment for us as a family. And then I started learning more and more about sensory and realising it needs to be every day in a planned way, you know, trampolining, massage, etc. There's a whole big list of stuff that we do now, which is great. And the other one with Ayana, she has a real high need for social interaction. She needed those tools of communication to be able to communicate appropriately. We'd have close friends or family come around and she'd be excited about it all day long. But as soon as they got there, you know, all the behaviours would come out, and it's because she didn't know how to communicate appropriately. So just building on that, and then by giving her the tools to communicate, we could then start building on relationships and meaningful relationships. And that also had to start with siblings. They were all fearful of her, you know. It was like we were a family, but we weren't a family unit. We were just all separate in the house. No one wanted to talk to each other, play with each other. So building those meaningful relationships, so we felt like a unit, and she felt she had a bond with her siblings. That was a big start as well.
Thanks, Jody and Maggie. I'll just quickly, as we put up this slide as Jody and Maggie were talking, so I guess with that iceberg concept, we're talking about all the different things that might influence a person, and also the family environment and everything else around them. But then we also think about, in some detail, what's happening for that person themselves. And sometimes it's really helpful to think about, you know, all those different individual things that might be happening. And then, of course, the importance of the environment in providing the supports around someone. And we talk about this idea of communication partners. So it's the people around the one we love. So it's really making sure the environment is tuned in to that person. And from those stories there, we were really hearing that, but we're also hearing how confronting that is, like with Jody's example of, you know, going out in public with chewies. That's a bit confronting and maybe a bit awkward, but because she understood how important that was for Ayana, she was able to do that. And of course for Ayana, that is incredibly important given her sensory needs. So looking at in some depth at the influencing factors for a person and around a person is part of how we navigate this thing called behaviour, by getting underneath it and understanding all the different things that might be influencing that.
All right, so what we've been talking about is that we're all unique people. We're all unique. We all have our own needs. Our children who engage in behaviour had their unique needs. And it could be, you know, the uniqueness about them if they've have an autism spectrum disorder or another diagnosis in terms of a disability. That still just brings with it uniqueness about how that person processes the world. What are their individual needs similar to ours? They're just different. So this is what we're talking about, is how do we understand what that person's needs are? What's going to help them process the world and the interactions around them that help them be in a place where they feel calm, that they feel in control, that they feel they've got connections with other people. So what do you think, I guess, what do we mean by unmet needs that we're talking about? And Jody and Maggie just gave some examples of where their kids were at in terms of some of their unmet needs. What do you think are some common things which sometimes can be not wrong, and that we're not, I guess, always meeting somebody's needs, but the reality is that sometimes that person's needs are just not in sync with the environment around them for various reasons. There could be lots of different reasons around that. So have you got any ideas about what are some common unmet needs in terms of that people have, or common needs that people have which sometimes are not met? Sensory needs? Yeah. we're going to talk about these a little bit more in depth in a minute. Yeah, and what do you mean by communication? It's a big thing.
For them to talk to you and you to talk to them, so they're able to, like, if they're frustrated, they can't always tell you and you can't always get it out.
Yeah.
They want something. Yeah.
So in a way, they're two different things, aren't they? One is the ability just to tell you what they're thinking. Yep, their ability. So tell you what they're thinking. The ability to interact with people, with others. And the other one that you talked about is the ability to tell you what that person wants at the time.
I guess it's also that they feel isolated because they can't communicate sometimes. And so they feel alone.
So isolation is sometimes. So what do you think then is the role of communication at the end of the day then?
To be able to share that, so you don't, like, see what someone understands.
Yeah. So what you're really talking about here is about connection and relationships. And somebody who has difficulty with communication, somebody who's engaging in behaviour that challenges a lot, do you find that that they might be a little bit more isolated than somebody else? Do you think they have less of a need for relationships and to interact than somebody else? It's harder for them, isn't it? It's really hard to gain that need. We all have the same needs. But unfortunately, sometimes people with disability, and often the more complex their communication is, the more isolated they are.
I was just going to say about the communication thing, one of the things would be the social ability to connect with other people.
Yeah.
Rather than just not the back and forth, hello, whatever, but the, I suppose it's relationship really, but
Yeah.
And you've
the
hit.
ability to,
Yep.
yeah,
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head. Is when we're talking about relationships and communication, the role of that is actually about social connection. And in fact, we're not going to go into this now. In fact, we don't normally talk about this, but a lot of the reasons for behaviour is actually people will use behaviour to socially connect with other people, to draw people in and to connect, even though it looks like they're pushing that person away. It sounds really unusual, but it's often, isn't it? And certainly Ayana, in Jody's family, Ayana has a huge social need. And she would engage in very challenging behaviours to connect with people, to get people to interact with her. Because when she hit them, what do people do? Turn around and start talking. Or it could be to tell her off. But in fact, what they're doing is trying to get that connection.
So what we see, I think, there is that behaviour fills the gap. And we often see that with people who have a limited social repertoire or limited communication skills. The behaviour actually fills the gap, and it tells us that they need help to expand their repertoire and their skills so they can engage more broadly and meet those interaction needs more effectively.
So what are some other common unmet needs, do you think? Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Emotional needs.
Yeah.
Knowing how to regulate their emotions and understanding emotions. My little girl, she understands when something happens to her, that she's hurt or needs something, but say something like I've got a toddler who's nearly 3, she fell off the couch, she went upstairs, came downstairs on the deck, and on the tiles, and my little girl, there was just no reaction. She just had no understanding of that, and I went absolutely nuts at her because she was sitting right beside her, and she just had no reaction. There was no emotion, no reaction at all, which I found really hard.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think what that tells us about unmet needs. I think, I guess I'm not really sure. But I think what that sort of is an indication of is to how that person processes emotional responses, definitely. What can, I guess, influence that is, I guess, what I'm trying to think about. Is, I guess, the influences to that is the uniqueness of her as perhaps that emotional centre of part of how she makes sense of other people's emotions is not as well developed as other people as yet. So what you're talking about there is that she needs support to develop that emotional reflection of other people, rather than it being the fact that that's wrong that she doesn't have that, is that she needs support to actually work through that. All right, so we might move on. These are really awesome reflections in terms of what are some common unmet needs. So Jackie's going to get up and help me talk about this, is that this is what we see as very common gaps in terms of what people experience as to what they're trying to communicate through their behaviour. And Maggie and Jody talked a bit about communication, and what was so awesome over here is that often people think about communication in a very therapeutic way, which is about teaching somebody words to tell you what they want. But in essence, what is commonly missing for people in terms of their needs is the role of communication for this, which is is this interaction between people and to connect and develop relationships with other people. And Jackie's going to talk a bit more about that at the moment. The other thing that has been brought up is sensory needs. We all in this room have unique sensory needs. Everybody does. This has nothing to do with disability. Okay? We all have our own sensory needs. I know for myself, once I started to really think about myself, is that noise is one for me. Is that actually when I'm calm and things are going well, noise doesn't bother me so much. But when I'm stressed and there's too much noise around me, it triggers me to be very reactive. Okay? Other people are really movement-based and they seek a lot of exercise, and if they get that need met every day, they feel calmer, they feel regulated because they meet that need every day to do that. Other people, it's about taking themselves away for quiet time for a little bit because it helps them stay calm, etc., etc. It helps their self-regulation. And that's the thing that we're talking about here is sensory. Everybody has sensory needs, but we tend to build it into our lives to help us feel regulated. Our kids who perhaps don't have their sensory needs met sometimes will be at this agitated level a lot of the time. And sometimes we only think about sensory after the fact rather than building it in so that they can keep their regulation down. So anyway, sensory stuff is a big area, and as I said, we're just going to talk about it for 2 minutes. Relationships and belonging, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but that's one of the really big things is people, as I said before, is people with disability tend to be more isolated in terms of how they develop relationships with other people. It doesn't mean that your needs are different. So it can be really difficult, and that person's trying to connect. Medical stuff, and Jackie's got a great story, not a great story, but a story about this in terms of sometimes we look at a behaviour and what we see And it could be actually a medical thing underlying. It could be pain that that person's not telling it, unable to tell you in a way. And that's really, and sometimes I know from personal experience at the moment, but within your families as well, is sometimes that's really hard, isn't it, in terms of whether is this health or is this behaviour, or which one is it, blah, blah, blah. And it's really hard to work that out sometimes, but it's important to keep it on the top of your mind in terms of let's not always assume that this is the behaviour under control of that person if they actually are experiencing some health difficulties. This is the one actually that we didn't come up with, and it sort of fits in here with control, is predictability, routine and control. And you guys talked about this a bit earlier in terms of some of your examples that when the routine is out, people can experience anxiety. Now, your brain actually not requires, but needs us to feel in control. We need predictability in our lives to feel like that we know what's happening and that we are in control. And when things happen around all of us that predictability is low, we will feel a sense of anxiety. We'll feel a level of stress. But what we tend to do is build supports into our lives that help us have a predictable routine. Okay? For some children, and autism is one of those areas where some children need a greater level of predictability. They really need to know what is happening. Okay, so, and if this, I guess, sometimes the environment around them, through no fault of their own or your own or anyone's own, is that if that predictability just doesn't match what they need for their predictability, then that person's going to be quite anxious and stressed, and they're going to place controls around them so that they feel in control. Does that make sense? Yeah? I've got an example of that actually for myself recently, is that recently I was feeling quite stressed because of lots of things happening around me, and my husband rang me and said, I'm doing this, this is done. And I said, I actually want you to take me through the steps of what you did. And he goes, no, it's all right, I did it. I said, no, I actually need you to tell me exactly what you did, not because I don't trust you, but because it actually helped me feel calmer. I just needed that level of predictability to help my stress levels go down. So it's really interesting just that our brains actually direct us in that way. And that's a really big thing for kids with disability. Unfortunately, the supports around kids, sometimes kids with disability, they need a lot higher level of supports to understand and predict their routines and what's happening than what we are able to do ourselves in terms of navigating that. And I'm going to hand over for the rest for you, Jackie, in terms of sexuality, dignity and stuff like that.
Okay. Do you want me to tell some stories
If you
about
like.
other ones? Okay.
Okay. So I think for us, sexuality became a really important unmet need, and I won't go into detail about that, but other than to say it can be quite difficult to get the support you need in that area. But if we're thinking about our family members as people that have the same needs as everyone else, this is a really important thing to start addressing. I'll just let you know, everyone gets to take home today one of these preparing to plan resources that we developed at an organisation called WACE, called WA's Individualised Services. You might have heard of WACE. Bron and I both work there, and there's a section, there are a set of cards for you to use in planning. So if you're doing any planning, if you're in an NDIA trial site or doing some planning just because you want to, which is the best reason to plan, there's actually a whole section on planning for sexuality and some of the things that you can be thinking about from the time that children are quite young, actually, to start being more aware of that aspect of life and preparing to meet those needs. So we'll say that's quite an important thing. And also personal dignity and self-worth and desires, and we talked a bit about especially how people who experience behaviour that can be seen as challenging, we can miss the self-judgment that they make on themselves and how they feel about their behaviour. And I think we saw quite a difference when we stopped blaming and judging our son and actually remembering to say it's okay. Actually, you don't need to say, there's times when I don't need you to say sorry, because he'd got into this pattern of saying he's got a sign for sorry. He'd do something because he was very distressed, then be saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, please forgive me. And just saying, you don't have to do that actually. It's okay, we get it, and it's all right, and we're all kind of going to take responsibility for what's happened for you there. I think also dignity and being treated with respect, and this is another one I've become a lot more aware of working with a bigger group of families, is that we often don't show the same respects to people who have disability and experience challenging behaviour as we do to others. So we might actually talk about them in front of them and about things that are actually not that respectful. So I'd noticed with my son that when we handed over from one person to another, that there'd be a whole discussion of his toileting that day. And then we started noticing actually that kind of made him shut down a bit. That was kind of embarrassing to him, but because he can't talk, no one notices that it has that impact on him. And as that happens through the day, and there's more and more indignity as people talk about you, you know, that can make things build up as well. So these are all things to think about. And I know now when behaviours start to emerge for him, it's very often my first thing is to look at how other people are treating him. Is it a good time to give an example of a couple of the others? Yeah? Okay. So look, I was just going to finish up because we've got lunch in a minute, but with this part of this discussion with a couple of stories. So relationships and belonging and medical needs and predictability are three big ones for us that we need to pay attention to. So something happened a few weeks ago. So my son goes to basketball and watches a basketball game with some friends that he went to school with that are still in his life. He doesn't play basketball because he's got some pretty complex physical disabilities, as well as, you know, complex communication needs and stuff going on, but he seemed to like doing that. But what started happening was that his behaviour was getting more and more challenging at basketball, to the point where the guys said, because he doesn't go with a support worker, his friends just support him there, we're not sure he wants to be here anymore. He's getting cranky and he keeps throwing stuff on the court during the game and making everyone really cross at him, and maybe he doesn't want to be here. So we had a bit of a chat about that and what might be going on, and one of his friends said, you know, maybe he wants to join in, you know, maybe he wants to do what everyone else is doing. And the other guy said, oh yeah, that makes sense, he's throwing stuff on the court, so maybe he wants to throw stuff on the court, you know. So what they did the next week was they gave him the opportunity to throw the ball and shoot the hoops before the game, and in the middle, what's that middle bit called? Interval. Half-time, that's it. Sorry. Sporting's not my strongest area of knowledge. And that actually sorted the issue out and he stopped being cranky. So we could easily have withdrawn him and excluded him from something where he actually wanted to have a sense of belonging. Another thing that's really important is predictability. So I'm eternally grateful to Debbie for letting me come along to a training session from her about the importance of routine and predictability. I had a really bad attitude towards visual schedules and routines because we'd had some in place before where they'd been used to control him, and he doesn't like being controlled by someone else. So it hadn't been a great experience. But once I understood that we could use them to meet his need to know what's going to happen next, it was kind of a game changer for us. So when we first started using a visual schedule, the people in Eli's life would say things like, well, I showed him his schedule this morning and he wasn't interested in it and he just pushed it away. So I'm really not sure that you know what you're talking about here. But what they came to understand was he needs it when he needs it. It's not for us to tell him what to do. It's when he's experiencing anxiety and he needs to know what's happening next, that's when it comes out, and it's a visual reminder or support for him to understand when he's anxious what the next step is. So some of the really tricky things that tend to stop for him is, he'll get stuck places. So he'll get stuck in the car and not want to get out, and he'll sit there for 5 hours in the car, actually, if he's feeling anxious. Whereas if we show him the visual support and say, okay, we're going to go inside and have lunch, and give him a few minutes to process, he'll get out of the car. So it's about learning not to say it's time to get out of the car. That's not something he wants to do. But if it's time to have lunch, or time to go and read a book together, or to go and watch a movie, then the movement from the car becomes a lot more easy for him. He also asks a lot of questions at times about what's going to happen, often around meal times, because that's an area that he has anxiety over. So he's capable of asking you 200 times, when's dinner, when's dinner, when's dinner, when's dinner, over and over again. And even though it's sign language, it's still quite taxing to be continually asked. Whereas if we preempt that and say, okay, we're going to do this, and then it'll be dinner time, he might ask 2 times instead of literally 200 times. So that's been a really big deal for us. And the other one, of course, is medical. So there's actually an example of a young guy in Albany that we've done some work with, and his behaviour, he's got very complex physical disability and no communication system really at the time, and his behaviour was that at times he would just scream, and the staff that were working with him actually saw that as a challenging behaviour and tried to do some stuff that wasn't that appropriate in response to that. But his mum started thinking about it, and lots of problem solving over months and months, trying to figure out what was going on, because there was no apparent pattern to this. And his mum finally managed to convince the doctor to get him a referral to swallow to get it explored, and they gave him one of those pills that's got a camera on it that you can swallow, and it went through his guts. And he just had so much ulceration through his esophagus and gut, and so there were periods of time in the day when he was in unbelievable pain. And that's been treated now, and that's not happening anymore, and he's had some relief, but he had years of that level of pain because he wasn't able to communicate what was going on. And that's why we're saying, let's not have as our goal to get rid of the behaviour, because the behaviour is a way of telling us that there's something wrong. If we take away people's way of doing that, it's kind of cruel, it's probably torture, right? So that's not our goal. Our goal's not to get rid of the behaviour. It's to minimise the person's need to manage it. And look, I just think we can't underestimate the complexity of getting medical support. For a lot of people, the research says that for people with disability generally this is difficult. When people have got some kind of complex communication need, it goes up. So we're in this right now at the moment. My son's been picking his nails so much they're infected, and we've been trying to figure out what's going on. And even though he has got a communication system in place, and he's been saying my feet hurt and my stomach hurt, it's actually taken us quite a lot of time and persistence to be able to figure out what that pain is about. So we found out that we're lucky he's got a very persistent support worker, because the doctor sent him off for foot x-rays and looked at his feet and kept saying there's nothing wrong with his feet. And my son's support worker went back and said there's got to be more tests you can do. And so they said, all right, we'll do an ultrasound. But it was very much, you guys are a bit obsessed about this. But it turns out he's got a bursitis in one of his feet, and it's very painful for him to walk. So what he was telling us all along was actually true. But even though he did have the communication system, we still needed the support for the message to be heard. So is it back to you, Deb, or shall we break for lunch?
I just want to say one more thing before we finish, before we break, and I'm just going to put these guys on the spot, which is, what we've been talking about is unmet needs. And where we started to talk about is that sometimes our focus is on the behaviour and fixing a behaviour, but now what we're talking about is actually how do you support somebody to have their needs met so they don't need to use the behaviour, is what we're talking about. So what I wanted Jody and Maggie to talk about, if you can, is that when you focus your attention away from fixing the behaviour and more about how to support that person, did you notice that the behaviour reduced? Because when...
You're making me yellow zone right now.
yeah. Or even Jackie, if you want to talk about. Because I guess what Jackie's talking about there is that we need to honour the fact that somebody is communicating to us through their behaviour and listen. But at the same time, what our goal is for the behaviours that are challenging to reduce. It's not, the goal isn't that that person will continue to engage in challenging behaviours, particularly if they're harmful for them and for other people. Oh, good. Because what we're talking about here is if you meet somebody's needs, they're less likely to need to use the behaviour to tell you that their needs are not being met. Because we're meeting the needs. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of Jamie's challenging behaviours was he doesn't like to wear clothes, which was fine when he was 2, but now that he's 12, it's a little bit awkward, especially for his siblings when they have friends over, sorry, naked boy coming through. So we didn't really know how to cope with this kind of behaviour. And what really was happening was, first of all, we went, it must be a sensory thing. He doesn't like clothes. Let's get him the softest clothes possible. And that seemed to make a little bit of a difference. But he was great about wearing clothes out in public. It was just when he was home that he wanted to take them off. So we were like, well, he deals with it pretty well when he's out of the house, so maybe it's not so sensory. And we nutted it out, and basically every time he had his clothes, we'd put his clothes on, he'd take them off, we'd put them on, he'd take them off. And he was getting a reaction from us. Oh, your clothes are off again. You've done it 2,000 times, so you're pretty much over it. But then when we decided to make a conscious effort of putting his clothes on and being really calm about the whole clothes thing, just undies on, like it's an everyday thing, not being really focused on the clothes themselves, but then taking the time to sit with him and having some little interactions with him, like talking to him with a book or looking on his iPad and singing songs. There's a whole lot of different things we do with him, but just giving him a little distraction, going away and coming back a few minutes later just to, undies on, great, but carry on interacting with him, and then extending that over a period of time, he can now keep his undies on at home. So it took just us interacting all the time, almost like a distraction for him, not to worry about the clothes, but for him to, he needed that kind of interaction. He needed the relationship and the social connection with us, and instead of him getting it through taking his clothes off, he now just gets it because we're interacting with him. So it made a huge difference to our lives because he's got clothes on.